You know the story. A curious girl falls down a rabbit hole into a world of talking animals, mad tea parties, and nonsensical riddles. For over a century, Alice in Wonderland has enchanted children around the world with its whimsical characters and dreamlike adventures. But the historical record reveals an origin far older and stranger than commonly believed. And once you understand the real context behind Lewis Carroll's masterpiece, you'll never see this children's classic the same way again. It's a cultural bomb, strategically disguised as fantasy, containing some of the darkest secrets of Victorian England. The story begins on a seemingly innocent summer day in 1862. Charles Dodgson, a mathematics lecturer at Oxford University, took three young sisters on a boat ride down the River Thames. The middle child, 10-year-old Alice Liddell, grew restless and begged Dodgson for a story with lots of nonsense. What emerged from his imagination that day would become one of the most analysed texts in literary history. But here's where the innocent origin story starts to unravel. When Dodgson died in 1898, his family made a decision that would forever cast a shadow over his legacy. They went through his personal diaries and deliberately removed entire pages, specifically the pages covering the period when he was closest to Alice Liddell and writing her story. Imagine that Oxford study, just days after the funeral. The smell of old leather and pipe tobacco still lingers. His sisters gather around the heavy oak desk where he wrote his fantastical tales. Someone opens the diary to June 27th, 1863, a date that should have documented a pivotal moment in the Alice story. They read the entry, then silence, a sharp intake of breath. Without a word, someone produces a pair of scissors. The metallic snip echoes through the room as page after page is carefully cut from the binding. Some accounts suggest they were burned in the fireplace. The names Alice and Liddell glimpsed in Dodgson's precise handwriting before the flames consumed them forever. The family members present that day took the secret of what they read to their graves. This physical act of deletion, carried out by his own relatives, implies a secret so devastating that scholars still debate its nature today. What could have been written in those journals that required such complete erasure from history? You have to understand the context here. Dodgson, who published under the name Lewis Carroll, had an unusual number of friendships with prepubescent girls. He photographed them extensively, wrote them elaborate letters, and created personalized stories just for them. In Victorian society, where propriety governed every social interaction, these relationships raised eyebrows even then. But without those missing diary pages, the true nature of his affections remains, as one biographer put it, as foggy as a clouded-looking glass. The manuscript itself tells another story. When Dodgson first wrote out Alice's adventures as a Christmas gift for the real Alice Liddell, it was a private, intimate creation filled with inside jokes and personal references only she would understand. But when he decided to publish it for the wider world, something fascinating happened. He didn't just expand the story, he specifically added the darkest, most disturbing chapters. The transformation of the Duchess's baby into a pig, the Mad Hatter's tea party. These weren't in the original gift to Alice. Carroll consciously chose to inject these elements of horror into what was supposedly a children's tale. While we can only speculate what this personal shadow was, we can see a different kind of darkness that he deliberately inserted into his story for the public. When he decided to publish it, he didn't just expand the tale. He transformed it into a vehicle for the hidden horrors of the world around him. Those scenes of Alice drinking mysterious liquids and eating strange substances that make her grow and shrink, that wasn't inspired by the psychedelic drugs that 1960s counterculture later claimed. The reality is far more disturbing and far more pervasive. During Carroll's era, opium wasn't some underground narcotic. It was in nearly every Victorian household. Historical records show that 5 out of 6 families regularly used laudanum, liquid opium, for everything from headaches to quieting restless infants. Mothers would give it to their babies to stop them from crying. The coroner's reports from that era tell stories that would horrify any modern parent. In 1854, a London mother named Sarah Whitfield confessed at an inquest that she had given her 6-month-old son a teaspoon of Godfrey's cordial, a popular opiate syrup marketed specifically for infants, every night to keep him quiet while she worked her 14-hour shifts at the textile mill. The bottle sat on her mantelpiece next to the family Bible, its sweet smell masking the narcotic within. One night, she gave him his usual dose. The baby fell silent immediately, as he always did, but by morning, his lips were blue and his tiny body was cold. The coroner recorded it as accidental poisoning by laudanum, one of dozens of similar deaths that month alone. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, another best-selling infant quietener, contained enough morphine sulfate to eliminate an adult if taken in excess. Yet advertisements promoted it with images of cherubic babies and promised mothers peace and quiet nights. The ease with which Alice consumes these transformation-inducing substances mirrors exactly how casually Victorians consumed their daily doses of opiates. But Carroll encoded something even darker in his expanded manuscript. Remember that scene with the Duchess and her baby that turns into a pig? The one he specifically added for publication? The text describes the infant's disturbing transformation. Its eyes were getting extremely small for a baby, and its nose was becoming much more like a snout than a real nose. Contemporary medical reports from Carroll's time describe something horrifyingly similar. Infants who were regularly dosed with laudanum by their caretakers would physically deteriorate. Doctors wrote that these narcotic-sickened children shrank up into little old men. The parallel is unmistakable. The Duchess's neglected, transforming baby isn't nonsense. It's a coded indictment of Victorian mothers who were literally poisoning their children with casual narcotic use. Infant mortality from opiate overdose was, in the clinical language of the time, an extremely common result. The same society that drugged its young ones was slowly poisoning its craftsmen, and in the quiet hum of industry, another madness was being born. The Mad Hatter, that beloved character known for his nonsensical tea parties and riddles, carries an even more tragic secret. You see, the phrase mad as a hatter wasn't just a quirky Victorian expression. It described a very real, very horrific occupational disease that was destroying workers across England. In 1860, at a hat factory in Stockport, workers spent their days bent over felting tables, turning rabbit fur into felt for gentlemen's hats. The process uses mercury nitrate, which releases toxic vapor into the air. Thomas Corbett, one of the workers, has been exposed to it for 8 years. Each morning, his hands tremble as he carries basins of mercury solution. By midday, the shaking worsens until he can no longer eat. His wife assumes he's drinking again, and his children keep their distance when his behavior turns erratic. After 2 more years, his speech becomes slurred, and he begins hallucinating, seeing giant rabbits in the corners of the workshop. His co-workers mock him as mad as a hatter, unaware he's suffering from mercury poisoning. Eventually, Thomas collapses at his station, his nervous system destroyed. The factory replaces him within a week. His widow receives nothing. Hat makers in Carroll's time used mercury nitrate to process rabbit fur into felt. Day after day, these workers breathed in mercury vapors in poorly ventilated factories. The metal slowly poisoned their nervous systems, causing what doctors called hatter's shakes, uncontrollable trembling that made it impossible to hold a teacup steady. The poisoning attacked their minds too, causing hallucinations, emotional instability, and speech problems that made them seem insane. The medical community knew about this as early as 1829. French doctors confirmed the connection in 1869. Yet in England, the suffering continued. The factory owners knew their workers were being poisoned. The government knew. The public knew. It was so common they had a saying about it. But nothing changed. The use of mercury in hat making wasn't banned until 1941, and only then because the military needed mercury for detonators in World War II. So when you watch the Mad Hatter's bizarre behavior at his eternal tea party, you're not seeing whimsical nonsense. You're seeing Carroll's brilliant encapsulation of systemic indifference to working-class suffering, an entire character built around an industrial disease that everyone knew about, but no one bothered to stop. The Queen of Hearts with her constant shriek of "off with their heads," seems like an over-the-top caricature of authority. But Carol was encoding very specific political commentary into her character. The scene where the card gardeners frantically paint white roses red contains a historical reference that would have been immediately recognizable to Victorian readers. The red rose was the symbol of the House of Lancaster. The white rose represented the House of York. These two royal houses fought the Wars of the Roses, one of the bloodiest periods in English history, where the throne changed hands through assassination and execution. In the winter of 1461, the snow in Towton turned red with the blood of 28,000 Englishmen, the bloodiest day in English history. Men were executed simply for wearing the wrong-coloured rose on their doublet. At Tewkesbury in 1471, Lancaster supporters who sought sanctuary in the abbey were dragged out and beheaded on the spot, their only crime being loyalty to a red rose instead of a white one. The Duke of Somerset was pulled from the altar itself and executed in the town square while his blood ran into the gutters. These weren't soldiers dying in battle. These were executions based purely on which flower you wore, which version of royal legitimacy you supported. The gardeners painting roses red weren't just following a queen's arbitrary preference. They were depicting the desperate attempts of subjects to display the right political allegiance to avoid execution. Carol's Victorian readers, raised on these historical horrors, would have instantly understood. Every time the Queen screams for someone's head, she's channeling centuries of English monarchs who did exactly that. Carol knew his audience would recognize this reference. He was showing them that the violent, capricious authority of the Queen of Hearts was no different from the actual English monarchs who had ordered thousands of executions based on political whims. In an era when Victorian society prided itself on law and order, Carol dared to suggest that their entire system of authority was as arbitrary and cruel as a playing card tyrant screaming for heads to roll. His satire of power didn't end with politics. It reached into the very roots of society, to the classrooms where the next generation learned not to think, but to obey. Picture a classroom in 1865 Oxford, not far from where Carol himself taught mathematics. 12 girls stand in identical brown pinafores, their backs rigid, hands clasped behind them. The air reeks of chalk dust and fear. They chant in perfect unison, "How doth the little busy bee improve each shining hour?" Not one of them understands what they're saying. Questions are forbidden. Curiosity is rebellion. The governess, Miss Strickland, holds a thin wooden cane that has already struck 3 sets of knuckles this morning for impertinent wonderings. This is education, mindless repetition until the words are carved into memory like epitaphs on stone. One girl, let's call her Margaret, will later recite these same verses at her wedding, at her children's christenings, on her deathbed, never once knowing what they mean, only that she must remember them perfectly or face the consequences. Alice begins her journey as a proper Victorian child, her head filled with multiplication tables, geography lessons, and moral poems she's memorized by rote. Watch what happens when she tries to use this knowledge in Wonderland. She attempts to verify her identity by reciting her lessons. Let me see. 4 times 5 is 12, and 4 times 6 is 13. Her geography becomes nonsense. London is the capital of Paris. Every piece of standardized knowledge she's been taught crumbles into meaninglessness. And here's the brilliant part. Carol, the Oxford mathematician, made Alice's multiplication technically correct if you shift number bases, a sophisticated mathematical joke aimed directly at his academic colleagues who were pushing increasingly abstract mathematical theories. Alice's complete psychological breakdown, "Who in the world am I? Ah, that's the great puzzle," occurs precisely because everything she's been taught to memorize has failed her. Carol was demonstrating that the Victorian education system, with its emphasis on rote memorization over actual understanding, was creating children whose entire identities could collapse the moment their memorized facts proved useless. The trial scene at the story's climax brings Carol's critiques together. The courtroom operates on pure chaos. Evidence is meaningless, logic is punished, and justice depends entirely on the Queen's mood. But this wasn't fantasy. It was barely even satire. In 1856, a case shook London that could have come straight from Wonderland. Mary Barrett, a seamstress from Whitechapel, was brought before the magistrate for stealing a loaf of bread worth 3 pence. She had 3 starving children at home and hadn't eaten in 2 days. The evidence was clear. She had taken the bread. She was sentenced to 6 months' hard labour in Newgate Prison, where she would die of typhus within 3 weeks. That same week, the Honourable Augustus Fitzhugh, son of an earl, appeared before the same court for assaulting a housemaid so severely she couldn't work for a month. Multiple witnesses testified to his violence. He was fined £1, less than the cost of his morning champagne, and released with a warning to conduct himself as befits a gentleman. The newspapers barely mentioned it. Victorian courts regularly featured trials just as arbitrary, where social status mattered more than evidence, and sentences could be passed based on a judge's disposition rather than law. When Alice finally stands up to declare, "You're nothing but a pack of cards," she's not just dismissing fictional characters. She's voicing what Carol saw as the ultimate truth about Victorian authority, that beneath all their pretensions of order and civilization, the powerful were nothing but arbitrary tyrants playing games with people's lives. Alice in Wonderland endures because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Children see a fantastic adventure. Adults recognize social satire. But historians see something else entirely. A coded map of Victorian England's darkest secrets. Those missing diary pages, destroyed by Carol's own family, ensure we'll never know the full truth about his relationship with Alice Liddell. Yet their very destruction speaks louder than words ever could. When your own relatives burn your writings rather than let them be read, the shadow cast is darker than any secret they might have contained. Carroll didn't write a children's story. He wrote an exposé, disguised just enough to slip past Victorian censors and into nurseries worldwide. The real magic trick isn't the disappearing Cheshire cat or size-changing potions. It's that Carroll hid a revolutionary manifesto inside a children's book, encoding criticisms so sharp they would have destroyed him if stated plainly. The next time someone tells you Alice in Wonderland is just imaginative nonsense for children, remember the truth. Sometimes the most powerful revelations can only be told through the mouth of a confused little girl, lost in a world that makes no sense because, in the end, neither did Victorian England.